Est-ce qu'il faut prendre des notes?
Non, il n'y a pas de questions, s'il vous plaît. Hein? Je vais être obligée de fermer les micros. D'accord. Alors, nous sommes maintenant 36. Il y a plusieurs personnes qui se longent à nous. Donc, si ça vous convient, je vais enregistrer la séance. Donc, c'est en cours d'enregistrement. Donc, comme je le disais, je voulais remercier Sandra, James et Guy-Philippe de participer. I'm going to be presiding this conference. I took the opportunity to organize this very short conference to discuss the impacts, economic impacts of the presidential election. And I subtitled it between or nationalism, populism, and globalization 2.0. So it's very vast, but I think that, with everything that has been said and done since the last 4 years, we know that and we expect some changes. And I thought that it would be a great idea to discuss with James Galbraith, who is at the University of Texas, and Sandra Polaski, who is a fellow scholar at the Boston University. I know that Sandra is in Paris right now, so we organize early conference. And James, I guess you're in Texas or somewhere else, I don't know. But Guy-Philippe is in Montreal, so it's quite an international panel today at a roundtable. And I will tell you how we're going to function. I asked 2 questions to the panelists, James Galbraith and Sandra Polaski. Basically, what are going to be the consequences of this election for the economic policies nationally, but also on the international economic relations. So I asked first that Guy-Philippe, that is the writer of La politique commerciale, la chronique sur la politique commerciale américaine au CEIM, je lui demande donc d'ouvrir la conférence en nous expliquant un peu comment il a analysé cette élection et comment il entrevoit un peu la suite des choses. Et ensuite, on pourra donc donner 5, 6, 7 minutes à chacun de nos panélistes, donc James et Sandra, pour continuer la conférence. Alors, Guy-Philippe, tu auras présentement très court, juste pour donner, mettre la table, 5 minutes, voir ton analyse. Tu peux le faire en anglais ou en français. Cette conférence, elle est bilingue. I think everybody is fluent in both languages and can hear each other and understand each other. So, Guy-Philippe, thank you for having accepted to do this with us, and tu as la parole.
I'm happy to defer to Sandra, but you want me to go first? I'll go first. I would just say very, very briefly on the first question, what will be the effect of the election on the economy? That it will be very substantial administrative changes in the government of the United States. It's very clear. And the nature of the personnel in a whole range of areas will be very different beginning in January. You can just see this from anything from energy policy, where it is likely to be much more actively engaged with the question of climate change, to education policy, where the leading candidates for education secretary in the paper this morning are both leaders of major American educational unions, National Education Association, American Federation of Teachers, labor policy, and anything, and for that matter, the Treasury Department. All of this will be under fundamentally different and broadly speaking, much more, actively progressive as opposed to actively reactionary hands. These changes are significant, but they are essentially administrative in character. They don't bear on the performance of the economy as a whole, which will depend upon matters that on 2 things. One is the evolution of the pandemic, and the other is the ability of the administration to get anything through the United States Congress. The question of the Congress is not settled because it will depend upon the outcome of the runoff elections in the Senate in the state of Georgia, where there are 2 Senate seats that are still up, and that will determine whether the Democrats have up to 50 seats, in which case, if they have them, they will have an effective majority with the vice president acting as the president of the Senate and able to cast the tie-breaking vote on a whole host of matters. In what is marginally more likely, the outcome that the Republicans retain control of the Senate, then I think one can imagine easily a situation which is substantially blocked, and in which the Senate majority has an active interest in preventing anything that major from supporting the performance of the economy. Because to the extent that the economy is not supported, the Republicans will have an advantage in both the House, certainly in the House, and perhaps also in the Senate in the 2022 midterms. And from that point, political events will take a different course. So I think one should not look very with any great optimism at the possibility of strongly expansionary policies being enacted in the early months of the Biden administration. Quite apart from whether the administration itself will be actively pushing for those policies, and I think very likely that they will at least initially favor them, and they may have second thoughts about it later on, because depending upon what kind of attitudes toward broad fiscal policy the administration brings with it. But even if they're reasonably aggressive and progressive in their early phase, the outcome of their ability to actually get significant measures enacted is certainly very problematic. Whether it matters or not, it depends upon again, as I said earlier, the state of the pandemic. We had some reasonably good news yesterday, the day before, about the prospects for a vaccine, but things are not yet settled on that front. The particular vaccine in question has distributional issues, which will now have to be resolved before it can be very widely available. In any event, production distribution would take well into 2021. And until that issue is resolved, one can expect, broadly speaking, that the American public will maintain a very cautious attitude toward drawing down the savings that have developed over the course of the last year, or using the services that provide effectively the millions of jobs that have been lost in the pandemic. If, on the other hand, things move very quickly, then perhaps things will recover somewhat more quickly. Although I'm inclined to think that almost whatever happens, the economy will face significant problems of restructuring in the wake of the pandemic, for three basic reasons. One is that the advanced sectors of the American economy, which depend on global markets, you think about things like aerospace, aircraft production, and so forth, are basically capital goods sectors, and they depend upon the world investment climate, which is obviously the bottom has fallen out in a number of areas. Nobody's going to buy an airplane from Boeing, even notwithstanding the problems of the 737 MAX, even overlooking them because when so many of the airworthy aircraft and they are sitting on the ground and nobody's flying. So we have those kinds of problems, which are going to be of a long-term character and not amenable to being affected by domestic expansionary policy. You have the problem that jobs in the American economy are largely services jobs, and in, many of these activities are simply dispensable. People don't need to go to bars and restaurants or to the gym, and they won't, by and large, resume those activities until it's safe from a health standpoint, and until they're reasonably confident that they have incomes themselves that they can afford to take on these activities, resume these activities, which is not something, is essentially a chicken and egg problem, if you like, that people won't have those incomes until other people are willing to spend. So that's a problem also, which may be somewhat resistant to domestic policy. And then the third big area is the problem is accumulating debts. We're presently under a series of a major forbearance and moratoria with respect to evictions and foreclosures expire at the end of the year. They may well be extended, but so far the contracts have not been revised. And so people whose incomes have been interrupted still have accumulating arrears in a range of areas which affect the stability of their housing. To the extent that that is not resolved, you can expect that that will also bear very heavily on people's discretionary spending and on their, and their willingness to engage in any kind of new activity. I expect that the difficulties that face the new administration will be quite serious. That would be my answer to the first question. Quite serious, and that in the absence of a real success led by my former student Stacey Abrams in Georgia in January, that the ability to resolve those issues through the congressional route will be extremely limited. I can come to Michèle's second question, but I'll maybe let Sandra tackle the first question. And she has much more expertise on trade policy than I do.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, James, for this very pessimistic, but I guess very realistic outlook.
Mm-hmm.
So Sandra, maybe you want to have your 5 minutes on the first question, and then maybe I'll ask Guy-Philippe to make a comment based on his analysis of what he did before. So Sandra, can you have 5 minutes? Thank you.
Are we allowed to ask questions down here?
There's gonna be a question period at one point.
Awesome. Okay, thanks.
Bonjour à tous. Thank you, Michèle. Well, first, I completely agree with everything that James has already said in terms of what I would characterize as two threshold questions about what can be done with the economy by Biden and his platform and the team he'll bring in. First, it will depend a lot on what happens in the Senate, and I'm an optimist by nature, but trying to win 2 seats in Georgia is going to be extremely challenging. You can't rule it out. All political attention in the country will be there for the next 2 months. And much of the maneuvering, I think, right now by the Republicans has to do with how they want to position themselves for that Georgia election, and doesn't necessarily tell us anything more than that. But in terms of the other threshold question, which is what's going to happen to the economy, where we are right now is about 11 million unemployed. So from the first and second wave of the pandemic and the associated shutdowns, about 21, 22 million jobs were lost. We've only regained about half of them. And now we're going into a very serious third wave. We don't know where we're going to come out. Again, the news about the virus yesterday was encouraging, but it's a long way from here to the point that the pandemic is tamed. Surely it's at least half a year, more likely a year and a half, or 2 years. And so there will be continued damage to the economy. Whether we end up in a mild recession or a deep recession or something even worse, I think is not possible to know right now. I do think that will, to some extent, affect the possibility of getting things through the Senate. If they end up holding the Senate with one vote, for example, if one of the Georgia seats goes to a Democrat and one to a Republican, which I think is a feasible outcome, then it would be a question of not only Mitch McConnell controlling the processes, but trying to pull 1 or 2 or 3 Republican votes over. And if the crisis is really extreme and severe, I don't think we can rule that out. So in terms of those 2 threshold questions, I agree with James, possibly a little bit less pessimistic. I would just like to outline in just a few quick sketches the Biden domestic economic policy, what he would like to implement if he is able to implement it, because I think it illuminates what he's likely to do on the international economic front and on the trade front. So I expect most people know that he campaigned on a platform of very large investments in infrastructure. This will depend on getting the budget, but enormous investments in traditional infrastructure, hard road, rail, et cetera, but also social infrastructure like schools, broadband. He campaigned on a platform that I don't think he called it industrial policy at any point, but in effect, an industrial policy of research, development, and other support to particular industries to try to build them up, create jobs, and create supply chains in the US. And in particular, an emphasis on autos, clean energy, artificial intelligence. So that was the second major area. And then the third big area of emphasis was to reinvigorate and strengthen the Buy America provisions. So local sourcing, domestic sourcing. All three of those areas obviously are intended to create jobs, and given the deficit of jobs right now, as well as the what I would consider the still fairly sluggish recovery from the previous crisis, the financial crisis, creating those jobs is going to be his highest priority. I outlined that. Again, you probably know most of those points, but I think when we get to the discussion of what his trade policy is likely to be, one has to go back by reference to that domestic policy, because that's the centerpiece of his economic plan. Let me stop there for now.
Merci beaucoup, Sandra. Thank you so much, Andra. So we just adjusted a little bit the agenda of today, and I would call upon Guy-Philippe, maybe Guy-Philippe, if you want to just bounce off some ideas on what have been said, and maybe if you have any questions for Sandra and Jamie, and then I'm going to take a round of questions before we move on to the international aspect of the debate today. So Guy-Philippe, maybe you have like 3-4 minutes. Est-ce que tu peux activer ton micro?
Oui, c'est ça, je vais activer. Merci beaucoup, Michèle, pour l'invitation. Mon intérêt personnel, je dirais, est lié avec à la politique commerciale des États-Unis. Puis la question, Michèle faisait référence à la chronique commerciale du CEIM. La question de la chronique commerciale était de savoir si l'élection de M. Biden constitue un retour à la normale en matière de politique commerciale américaine. Alors, on se demandait d'abord qu'est-ce qu'était la normale. Pour résumer très, très rapidement, qu'est-ce qui est la normale depuis une trentaine d'années, hein, c'est que sous les gouvernements démocrates ou républicains, il y a eu une multiplication des accords commerciaux. Alors, une forme d'accord bipartisan depuis 1990 pour encourager la libéralisation des échanges commerciaux. Qu'est-ce que M. Trump a changé suite à son élection? M. Trump a décomplexé le discours protectionniste, qui était un discours qui était davantage démocrate. Il y avait une partie du Parti démocrate qui privilégiait des mesures protectionnistes, et ça depuis des décennies, et une partie des démocrates qui, eux, étaient plus favorables à la libéralisation des échanges et qui étaient ceux qui faisaient le pont avec les républicains qui étaient eux aussi plus favorables à la libéralisation des échanges. M. Trump a mélangé les cartes, brassé les cartes avec un discours protectionniste qui s'adressait, c'est ce que je propose dans la chronique, aux swing states, aux États qui ont été les perdants de la mondialisation, là où les emplois industriels, les emplois manufacturiers sont disparus au cours des 40-50 dernières années. Mais parallèlement à ça, le discours protectionniste que M. Trump a utilisé, il l'a utilisé comme outil de négociation auprès de ses partenaires commerciaux. Alors, il a poursuivi quand même une politique de libéralisation des échanges au cours des dernières années. Il a négocié un accord partiel avec le Japon, un accord partiel avec le Brésil, et des négociations en cours avec le Royaume-Uni. Alors, le discours protectionniste de M. Trump n'est pas un discours qui exclut la possibilité de signer de nouveaux accords commerciaux, mais un discours d'utilisation de la puissance américaine pour arriver à des accords commerciaux qui sont plus favorables aux intérêts américains. Maintenant, on appelle ça encore des accords commerciaux, mais la manière de négocier de M. Trump fait en sorte qu'on pourrait dire davantage que ce sont des traités de paix commerciale, hein, comme c'est l'expression de Christian Debloc que j'ai trouvé très appropriée. Mais on a vu au cours des derniers mois que les mesures protectionnistes de M. Trump, utilisées dans le cadre de ces négociations, ont montré des limites dans la création d'emplois manufacturiers, dans la création réelle. Les emplois manufacturiers, les emplois industriels qui étaient promis ne se sont pas matérialisés dans les régions qui étaient visées. On a vu aussi que les rapports de force en matière commerciale ne sont pas si clairement définis. Ce n'est pas parce que les États-Unis ont la puissance économique que les mesures protectionnistes n'auront pas des effets très négatifs sur leur économie. Donc, c'est la complexité des mécanismes de distribution des sanctions économiques, puis la multiplicité de leurs effets, vu l'interdépendance des partenaires commerciaux, fait en sorte que le discours protectionniste, les mesures protectionnistes ne donnent pas les résultats escomptés. Et on a vu, à mon avis, une interprétation qu'on peut faire du résultat électoral de la semaine dernière, c'est que les électeurs que M. Trump avait convaincus en 2016 avec son discours anti-mondialisation ont été déçus des résultats des 4 dernières années. Et donc, se sont tournés vers M. Biden, qui, lui, a adopté, et je pense que c'est un des impacts majeurs de la présidence de M. Trump, a adopté un discours de nationalisme économique aussi. Un discours probablement plus nationaliste que ses prédécesseurs démocrates. Alors, en proposant un programme, comme Mme Polaski l'a souligné, un programme massif de dépenses en infrastructure qui pourrait profiter au secteur manufacturier, au secteur industriel américain. Alors, quels sont rapidement les effets, à mon avis, de l'élection de M. Biden? Bien, il y a des effets de discours, je pense qu'on le voit déjà. Il y a la relance de la coopération internationale. Hein, déjà, M. Biden a contacté ses homologues. Bon, ce n'est pas encore ses homologues, il n'est pas encore président, mais ses partenaires commerciaux, ses partenaires politiques. Déjà, il y a des plans de rencontres internationales. Donc, il y a tout un climat politique qui s'installe de coopération internationale qui est plus classique. Alors, en ce sens-là, il pourrait y avoir un retour à la normale du point de vue du discours. Un genre de repositionnement des États-Unis comme leader mondial de la coopération internationale. Maintenant, pour ce qui est des mesures concrètes, je pense que nos deux panélistes l'ont bien souligné, les priorités politiques, les priorités économiques vont être intérieures. Le programme Buy American de M. Biden, qui est l'essentiel de son programme économique, ce n'est pas un programme de libéralisation des échanges, hein. C'est un programme de renforcement de l'achat local qui, peut-être par des mesures même de négociation avec les partenaires commerciaux, permettrait davantage aux États d'acheter localement. Mais on peut concevoir qu'il y aura une poursuite des négociations en cours avec des partenaires commerciaux, surtout ceux qui sont du même niveau économique, comme le Royaume-Uni et comme l'Europe. Parce que c'est la grande résistance démocrate, c'est souvent là où les conditions de travail où les conditions environnementales sont très différentes de celles qu'on trouve aux États-Unis. Alors, ce n'est pas vraiment le cas au Royaume-Uni, ce n'est pas vraiment le cas en Europe non plus. Alors, il serait possible qu'il y ait quand même une progression des négociations commerciales sur ce plan-là. On peut penser aussi qu'il y aura eu un apaisement à l'OMC. La relation entre l'administration Trump et l'OMC a été très, très antagoniste. Je crois qu'au cours des prochains mois, on va voir un apaisement, mais un apaisement qui donnera quoi comme résultat dans la mesure où il serait très étonnant de voir des progressions d'accords multilatéraux au cours des prochaines années. On peut penser aussi qu'il y aura une pause dans les négociations bilatérales, une concentration sur les affaires de politique intérieure, mais peut-être la poursuite ou l'amorce de négociations plurilatérales sectorielles, parce que les intérêts américains sur la propriété intellectuelle, sur le commerce numérique, sur la coopération réglementaire demeurent importants. Les intérêts, l'exportation des normes américaines dans ces secteurs-là demeure importante. Alors, on peut penser que des programmes, des négociations comme le Trade and Service Agreement pourraient être éventuellement relancées. Voilà. Ben, je vous remercie de votre attention. Si je peux relancer avec une question, je me demande de quelle manière les démocrates, en fait, de quelle manière le repositionnement, est-ce qu'il est possible qu'il y ait un repositionnement politique aux États-Unis entre les démocrates et les républicains sur la question du commerce international, de la libéralisation des échanges, aussi le repositionnement que M. Trump a instauré durant son mandat risque de durer?
Merci beaucoup, Guy-Philippe. Finalement, ton entrée en matière, la table que tu devais mettre, finalement, tu remets en place certaines idées qui ont été exprimées auparavant, mais en plus, tu fais le pont avec la deuxième question, donc c'est très bien. Je pense qu'on aurait dû d'ailleurs le prévoir comme cela. Alors, je donnerai la parole à James et ensuite à Sandra, et on pourrait aussi, j'ai des questions qui arrivent dans la conversation. So so James and Sandra, another 5 minutes each, and then we'll open to questions. Thank you.
Well, I certainly don't have 5 more minutes, but just generally on the question of international relations, and I'll defer to Sandra completely on the question of trade policy. But broadly on the question of international relations, we're obviously going to see a major resurgence of the United States into a number of agreements and international participations which have been suspended or interrupted under Trump. Biden is going to rejoin the World Health Organization, essentially on the first day of his term. He's going to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change, for whatever that may be worth in practical terms. Is going to obviously try to renew and generally smooth out relations with NATO allies and so forth. All of these things will be done, I think, relatively quickly. The broad foreign policy orientation of the team is likely to be very similar to that of the Obama administration, and therefore, in some respects, substantially more aggressive and with respect to interventions around the world than was true under Trump. Although the one big question is whether that applies to Iran, where the possibility of rejoining the JCPOA is definitely in the air, although what that will be done or not, I think is not yet entirely sure. However, I would argue that the world situation is substantially different than it was in 2016, 2017, and that the potential for highly active U.S. policy, particularly in the military sphere, is much less. And that the position in Syria is very different. The position in Ukraine is very different. The position with respect to China is very different, notwithstanding the efforts of the Trump administration to confront the basic Chinese projects, the Belt and Road Initiative, and so forth. So whatever the broad attitudes of the incoming Biden team, I think they will be facing a reality which has evolved substantially in the 4 years since the last time Democratic foreign policy establishment was effectively in power. So that said, on commercial agreements, again, Sandra is much more of an authority than I am. The Biden rhetoric is not going to be as aggressively globalist and free trade oriented as past Democratic administrations. I think that moment has clearly passed, and for political, if not for reasons of broader conviction, Trump clearly demonstrated the vulnerability of Democrats on the question of trade, and they will be conscious of that going forward. So I'm not sure whether I would expect that there would be a broad change in the underlying commercial policy. Some of the most aggressive people in the Trump team, particularly with respect to China, will be gone. But the tendency of U.S. politics to ratchet up hostility simply for the purpose of avoiding the problem of being undermined on the domestic political front, too soft on this, too soft on that, is an old problem in American politics. So anybody who speaks out in favor of smoother relations with major powers like China or Russia is likely to be considered politically suspect, and therefore that tendency may not be particularly evident, even with respect to, let's say, the people who feel that the Trump that the Trump team was engaging in an aggressive and let's say not necessarily productive acts of confrontation with other major economic powers, particularly with China. So on that, I'll let Sandra speak to an area where she has a great deal of expertise and authority.
Well, in terms of trade, Biden has said that he's not going to negotiate any new trade agreements until he has seen the economy recover, until he has helped the economy to recover from the economic crisis. That's a big statement, but I'm inclined to think that it's accurate, that it reflects his intentions for a couple of reasons. One, his administration is going to be tremendously occupied with trying to deal with the enormous economic fallout of the pandemic. And they're not going to want to spend a lot of political capital on controversial issues. If you think about the new trade negotiations that the Trump team has teed up, you think about India, Brazil, Kenya, even UK, these are not going to be priorities for Biden. And so it's hard to see that on any of those fronts he would want to go forward. And I think as James indicated, the 2016 election itself and the difficulty for the Democrats to prevail at the presidential level in this recent election shows that they understand that the very corporate-oriented trade policy that had been pursued by many administrations, both Republican and Democrat, over 30 years, including the Obama administration, had opened the Democrats to an enormous electoral liability. And so there is no longer that same consensus that more trade is always good in the Democratic Party. That's not to say that there aren't still strong advocates for it. And there have always been strong critics. I've often been in that camp, but I think that the center of gravity in the party now is not as enthusiastic about negotiating free trade agreements. Let me put it that way, because I want to distinguish between trade agreements, negotiating trade agreements, enforcing trade agreements from trade itself. Trade is good. I don't think any of us think that specialization and exchange is a bad thing for humans to do. It's a question of the kinds of trade agreements that have been negotiated. And as I say, the Democrats realize now that the path that they were on was very damaging to them in terms of their political standing and their ability to hold office. So I don't expect to see new trade negotiations in the foreseeable future, the first year to maybe the entire first term of a Biden. However, I think that there will have to be a significant engagement to renegotiate or modify some trade agreements if Biden is to carry out the domestic policy that he has pledged himself to, and which I think actually reflects his own personal worldview of what's necessary. Probably the most obvious example of that is the Buy American, because Buy American is highly constrained by the WTO GPA, the Agreement on Government Procurement. by many of the trade agreements. I mean, I understand that Canada was not so enthusiastic about the government procurement sections in USMCA, but many of the other US free trade agreements are very strong and very restrictive on that. So the Biden team, if they actually want to go forward with that, and I believe that they do, and in fact, that's something they can do without any Senate votes. And so it's one of the areas of policy where they're holding the levers. They're going to have to either ignore those agreements, and that's not going to be the way that they want to come on the world stage of simply being defiant the way Trump was, and they criticized Trump for being. So I think it means either renegotiating, asking trading partners for a moratorium, or withdrawing. And I don't think withdrawing is entirely far-fetched, because the Trump administration actually floated some ideas of withdrawing from GPA earlier this year in a different context for different purposes. But it seems to me that either a moratorium or renegotiation with the bargaining leverage of potential withdrawal is likely to be on the table, so that they can pursue the Buy American, Made in America, building up US jobs and so on, that not only is an important part of the overall platform, but it's one of the few things that they really don't need Republicans to do. They can do it all through administrative action. So that's one point. But I think more profoundly, even than that, if some of the ideas of real investment in industries, and real investment in supporting the development of a clean energy industry, of electric cars, et cetera, in the US, if they are to pursue that, they're going to run into a number of the constraints that were negotiated very often at the insistence of the US itself, in terms of anti-subsidy provisions, in terms of anti-state aid, many of the provisions, not many, well, some provisions of TRIPS around pharmaceuticals, around medical equipment and so on, some of the provisions of TRIMS, all of these things that the US negotiated are going to be constraints on what a Biden administration can do in terms of domestic industrial policy. And so they certainly are not going to want to propagate them, as far as I can see. And I think that they will end up needing to, over time, consider a renegotiation or a moratorium on some of those provisions as well. I mean, where I think you'll see a rather dramatic change, and I certainly hope so. For example, in early 2020, I think it was in January or February, the US, the EU, and Japan announced that they were going to launch an effort to really tighten down the anti-subsidy, state-owned enterprise, state aid provisions. If they couldn't do it multilaterally, they would do it through a plurilateral. And of course, the entire target of that was China. Well, now in Europe, for example, where I am, the discourse has shifted enormously. The talk is of much more about national champions, supporting national champions. There is enormous state aid across all the countries that can afford to do it and have the inclination to do it. There is taking up equity stakes in companies, state ownership of parts of companies, in some cases pretty substantial parts of companies, in many countries in Europe. And so the discourse about constraining public ownership of private firms, the discourse about subsidies and state aid has shifted very dramatically as a result of the reactions to the pandemic. And so I think these are going to be the kinds of issues that the Biden administration will have to step up and talk about, either renegotiating, suspending through a moratorium if we can get an agreement, or even threatening to walk away if they want to carry out their domestic policy. So I think that the pandemic has really made a very substantial shift in terms of what the universe looks like for what one would try to do in trade policy if you're a Biden administration.
That's a very interesting point, and I'd have to say, good luck with trying to compete with the Chinese on the question of, state-owned or state-sponsored industrial enterprises. And that it is not, it's perhaps not the safest bet that any country ever made. The other point I'd just make quickly, and is that I think Sandra pointed out correctly that the major emphasis in the platform has been on infrastructure and on industrial development, but this is not where the jobs in the American economy are. And practically every job that was created in the last 15 or 20 years or even longer has been in the services sector. And those jobs are the ones that went away in the pandemic. So it will be very interesting to see if there's any significant thinking about how you deal with the workforce that we actually have, the work that people have actually been doing, office work, services work, small and medium enterprises, in order to kind of bring people back into the labor force and give them a source of income. As you're not going to create millions of jobs for former office workers or former restaurant and bar employees or coffee shop people, pouring concrete, hauling rebar, or in industrial activity. It's simply not how industrial activity is actually carried out in the modern economy. So there's a kind of a disconnect between a kind of a sort of old thinking about what it takes to support the economy and what actually the pandemic has done to the livelihood of Americans.
Merci, merci pour ces réponses. Donc, je vais prendre quelques questions. D'ailleurs, les questions qui circulaient dans la conversation ont d'ailleurs été pas mal répondues dans les réponses, les interventions qui ont été faites. I was just thinking, just listening, that the both questions, like the intervention of the state in the US economy that is going to be happening, and at the same time the re-questioning of the trade policy of the US and the role of the US, internationally, traditionally is quite important. I think they're really linked, and it made me think of this intervention, the conference that we had last Friday with Pascal Lamy, who was saying that, and we were discussing this, he was stating that actually the rearticulation of the national economic space and the international sphere is at the core of what is going to happen within the pandemics, and also within the deep reasons why Trump was elected. And I guess that's what I hear is at the nexus of what you've been saying. I would like to hear you about that. Do you think that a time of we're talking sometimes about this big reset internationally? Do you think that we should discuss these points where national intervention has to be made acceptable or legitimized internationally? Do you think we are able to have this conversation, and where does it lead with, as James, you said, there is on one side China, and then there is on the other side the Europeans, and then there is the United States. Do you think that we can have like this harmonized language on this issue? This is a question for the three of you, Guy-Philippe, Sandra, and James, and also I will take a round of questions afterwards.
Let me jump there. Before the pandemic, I would have said that although it would make sense for the US to not pursue this heavy deregulatory agenda through trade agreements, that's what I would call many of the things that the US has negotiated, is forcing other countries to either deregulate or to constrain the regulatory space. Before the pandemic, I could not imagine a Democratic Party that I know, certainly not the Republican Party, stepping back from that. After the pandemic, I absolutely think it's going to be on the agenda, because the small government philosophy, get government out of the way, let the private sector do it, has, it has crashed and burned. I mean, the solutions have been massive monetary intervention, massive fiscal intervention, massive physical activity organized by government, which could not be supplied by the private sector. So I think this has changed the mood. If there is a relatively rapid recovery from the economic crisis caused by the pandemic, maybe that moment will pass before real changes become consolidated. I don't think there is going to be such a rapid recovery. I'm seeing 2, 3, 4 years of real economic pain in the United States and many other countries. And so I think this question of at a minimum, rolling back some of the rules that are constrained, that would constrain reasonable government behavior to intervene more in the economy, is going to be staring the Biden administration right in the face.
I would add to that with the developments even before the pandemic, it's really hard to see why any government dealing with in the international negotiations would exceed to further restrictions on their ability to intervene. I mean, certainly in the case of China, it's hard to see why the Chinese would pay the slightest attention to anything other than what their national interests appeared to be in the arrangement of their domestic economy. Not that they paid a great deal of attention even before, but and then they look at the Russians or any government that's been subject to major sanctions, the leverage to then say, well, we're all going to go play in a nice deregulated sandlot does not seem to me to comport with the change in environment that occurred even before the pandemic. But the pandemic certainly reinforces it. One has to take care of one's own situation first and foremost. So fully agreeing with Sandra on that point.
Guy-Philippe?
Oui. Eh bien, je suis tout à fait d'accord. Je crois que la pandémie a un effet important pour recentrer les pouvoirs, l'action sur les gouvernements locaux. Alors, on était, je dirais, depuis plusieurs années, sinon plusieurs décennies, dans une logique de toujours moins de local pour plus de mondial. Ben, la pandémie nous montre que l'importance des gouvernements locaux, la scène internationale a été vraiment désorganisée par la pandémie et la réponse est venue des gouvernements locaux. Alors, je crois que cette réalité-là va laisser des traces au cours des prochaines années et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous qu'une des premières mesures du gouvernement Biden en matière de commerce international risque d'être d'amorcer une négociation pour faire en sorte que les gouvernements locaux soient moins contraints par les ententes internationales pour acheter localement. Et ça va avoir un impact important au Canada. S'il y a un renforcement de l'achat local aux États-Unis, de quelle manière le Canada va réussir à s'intégrer ou non à une politique de cette nature-là, ça va avoir un impact très, très important sur l'économie canadienne.
Oui, on a eu plusieurs questions dans la conversation. We have many questions on the impact of the election on Canada. I don't know if you have anything else to say about that. Well, Sandra, you talked about maybe like a sort of a renegotiation of the trade agreement linking Canada and US and Mexico. Do you see that happening quickly or later?
Well, some of the issues that I was talking about are not directly at stake in the USMCA. For example, some of the government procurement, that's more of a WTO issue, and the other free trade agreements. My guess on USMCA is that the inclination on the part of the US, and I would expect Canada and Mexico, certainly Mexico, probably Canada, and probably US, will be to let the USMCA get implemented, let it roll out, let it have the experience of what's going to happen for a year, 2, 3 years. I don't think that there is going to be any desire in the US to revisit it. There was an odd bipartisan consensus in the US once the Democrats in the House of Representatives went back and renegotiated parts of it. Now there is a bit of an bipartisan ownership of USMCA. It's pretty superficial, but I think it will hold for the time being. Where I would expect to see some pressure is the USTR will feel pressure to take some cases on labor and the environment under the USMCA if cases arise, and chances are they will in Mexico in any case. And so I think that they'll feel some pressure on particular issues like that, but I don't really see a revisiting of USMCA in the very near future, because as I say, there is this sort of bipartisan ownership of it in the US.
Mm-hmm. Merci. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask question. I don't see any hands asking for.
Oh, sorry, it's because people have been writing the questions directly in the chat.
Yeah, so do you have a short question?
Well, I had one
Yeah.
short, I don't know. So basically I had a question about like the capacity or not from the US to maintain its hegemony, whether it's economical or even military, despite its growing debt in general, that's really acts toward China, the deaths due to COVID, and Biden's vision of the economy and of protectionism that you guys have just explained to us.
Okay, merci. Thank you so much for that question. I would add one question to the three of you. If you had to do something differently than Joe Biden would do, what would you suggest? What would you advise Joe Biden to do differently that he's doing right now, like in terms of your analysis? So we can take another round, short round of answers from James, Sandra, and Guy-Philippe. Thank you.
Well, the question of U.S. hegemony, hegemony is a very broad term. It seems clear to me that in many respects, the U.S. position is substantially weaker than it was 5-10 years ago. Whether that is understood in U.S. policy circles clearly in a realistic way is not so clear. But as I said earlier, it's obvious that the situation in Syria is now basically at the end of a long development. I think it's pretty clear that what was a potentially explosive situation in Ukraine is no longer terribly explosive. And things could go worse, but the situation has been in deadlock at best for quite a few years. And so as one looks around at places that were potential flashpoints 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't expect that there will be that the Biden administration will be provoking the potential of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, for example. That it was, I think, even a remote possibility, even under the most aggressive policies of the Trump administration. So the world situation is evolving, and it's evolving in Europe, I think pretty clearly, with a reassertion of some German leadership in the European Union. That the U.S. is going to have to accommodate itself to this. Is this going to mean a major change in world financial relationships? That I'm much more skeptical of. The people have been predicting the potential decline or demise of the U.S. dollar as the medium for world finance. They've been predicting this for 30 years, and it hasn't happened. It doesn't appear to be happening simply because there's no clear alternative. There's no international alternative to take over the role. And then the regional alternative, the euro, has not succeeded in doing so. And nothing else comes close to having the same basis in the vast and liquid U.S. financial markets that the dollar does. So I'm always inclined to say the last word on that one goes to the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, allegedly late in his life, who remarked that the Almighty Providence takes special care of drunks, fools in the United States of America, and that may continue. That luck may continue to hold for a while longer. Nothing is forever, but.
Thanks a lot.
I'll come in on your question, Michèle, which is if I were to tell Biden to do something different than he's doing, I think many of the things that he proposed in his platform were sound and were well balanced in terms of what was possible. But the one thing that is not actually part of his program at this point, and it goes to the problems in the U.S. domestic economy that Jamie was pointing out, which are the fact that heavy infrastructure is not going to absorb a lot of the people who are unemployed from the service sector. But I think if in fact the crisis is as deep as I tend to fear. I think the US needs a real jobs program, one or more jobs programs like what we had during the Depression, because you can create a jobs program which can absorb all of those skills. There are huge underserved services needs in the US, whether it's childcare, daycare, elder care, every kind of care, arts, fostering community activities and so on. There are enormous amounts of things that can be done that can absorb service sector talent, service sector skills, in addition to the infrastructure and the retrofitting for environmental purposes and so on, which go across a spectrum of heavy work to not so heavy work. So I think a conscious jobs program is the one thing that is not explicitly in his program, although a lot of the Biden program involves creating jobs, but creating a job program per se, where you're guaranteeing, particularly in the most affected communities, most affected by the pandemic, because the impact has been extremely uneven, that I think that's where he should go. And if things get bad enough, I think that's probably where one of the few things that he will be able to do. It's also a question of being able to perhaps reprogram some funds that are there to be able to launch such a program, even if he can't get $1 trillion or even $500 billion through the Senate.
Let me just add to that this is a moment to think in terms not just of a program, but of a job guarantee, which is essentially an elastic system in which you can come in and get employment in a public or nonprofit entity that's funded by the public sector on demand, and this would greatly relieve the problem. But I would add to that one other thing, which is that a vast number of the services enterprises in the United States are at this point hanging on by threads. They're open many of them have closed, of course, and you can see this boarded up all over the country, boarded up small businesses. But the ones that are open are not working at anything like the utilization rates that are required to turn a profit. So they're operating basically on their reserves, on their capital, and they won't continue forever. It's a very fragile situation, and so if I were advising them, I would say you got to look at that and think in terms of how you set up a cost sharing or a cooperative arrangement. And something like this has been done, I think, in Germany, where you can get services, small businesses, services establishments generally, keep them functioning for whatever it takes, 6 months, a year, 18 months, that things can begin to return to something like a normal process. I mean, obviously interrupts market adjustment, but in the current situation, the last thing you want is for there to be a kind of a spreading blight in which shops close down and restaurants, bars, coffee houses, gyms close down, and as a result, the neighborhood loses its attractiveness, and the viable enterprises also close down. You can easily see this spreading out across the country, and I would pay attention to it immediately. So, in addition to jobs, you've got to do something to keep businesses going.
Merci, James. Guy-Philippe, est-ce que tu veux ajouter quelque chose en termes de réponse? Ou bien? Oui?
Je dirais, de mon point de vue, un des problèmes importants des États-Unis, un des problèmes économiques importants des États-Unis, c'est la répartition régionale de la création de la richesse. Il y a d'énormes inégalités entre les différentes régions américaines, surtout du point de vue des changements, des bénéfices des changements technologiques. Les entreprises qui bénéficient et les personnes, les individus qui bénéficient des changements technologiques, de l'ouverture, de la libération des échanges, de la mondialisation, sont localisés vraiment dans à peine quelques petites régions américaines et sont énormément bénéficiaires du contexte économique, de la situation économique, des changements technologiques, alors que la plupart des autres régions aux États-Unis n'en bénéficient à peu près pas. Alors, si, je ne sais pas, je n'ai pas de solution magique, mais si M. Biden pouvait trouver un moyen, si l'équipe économique pouvait trouver un moyen d'assurer une meilleure répartition régionale à travers les États-Unis de la création de la richesse, c'est un grand programme, j'en conviens, mais sans doute, d'abord, ça permettrait de mieux répartir la richesse, de faire en sorte que les changements économiques bénéficient davantage à l'ensemble de la population américaine. Puis, ça ferait, politiquement, ça pourrait changer le paysage pour surtout les régions qui sont laissées pour compte depuis des décennies par les gouvernements américains.
Vaste projet, effectivement. Mais donc, écoutez, je vous remercie beaucoup tout le monde. Il est déjà presque midi. Il faut qu'on fasse ça plus souvent. C'était fort intéressant. It's very interesting, and I just mentioned that we should do that more often. Invite you guys from the United States and have more, sustained conversations, dialogue, throughout the year. J'ai un étudiant dans mon cours. Vous savez, on a été quand même une bonne soixantaine aujourd'hui. Merci à tous les participants aussi. Mathieu avait une question sur le rôle de l'État. Alors, Mathieu, tu as la parole.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your interesting answers. It was really helping us to have more issues, to discuss about more issues we can think about the United States. I just want to ask if we have seen that in large part of the United States, in the suburbs, a lot of voters traditionally voting for the Republican Party going to Joe Biden, especially women. Does that mean that they agree to the Democratic platform with more place for the state and regulation? I've seen, for example, the widow of Senator McCain, C.D. McCain, saying that supporting Joe Biden, saying they need to have more bipartisanship, for example, for healthcare. So, is there kind of a new revolution, like after 3 decades of conservative revolution?
I'll take
yeah.
Sandra, go ahead.
Okay.
No, it was Michèle, but yeah, Sandra, you can go ahead and then.
I know Mathieu raises a very interesting point about what were those people thinking in the suburbs when they were shifting. And I think there are a few things that we know from not only polls around the elections, but surveys in between. In 2018, when suburban counties that had voted for Trump in the presidential election 16 swung over and voted for Democratic legislators in the House of Representatives, we know that one of the biggest issues on people's mind was healthcare. And it had to do with the sustained attack by Trump and the Republicans on Obamacare, but in general, being completely insensitive to the struggles people were having with healthcare. The premiums going up, the copays going up, the quality of the coverage constantly being whittled back. I mean, that was something that even people in white collar jobs with fairly good salaries, with good skills, their healthcare was being eroded. And of course, people who were poor were in much worse shape. But I think in the suburbs, that was the top issue. It wasn't the only issue, but it was the top issue. Trump's personality, character, his coarseness, I think, drove away particularly women in the suburbs. So there was a cultural or psychological factor, but the healthcare was very big in 2018. This time, it was clearly the pandemic that people were reacting to in terms of the default by the government to deal competently, by the federal government competently with the pandemic, left people in the situation in their own households having to make extremely difficult sacrifices, difficult choices about what to do with the kids, and would both parents continue to work, could they continue to work, et cetera, when the kids weren't in school, getting laid off. And I think that, so this time I would say it was the pandemic. Now, it's not an accident that also was a health crisis, because now we have probably an additional 15 million people without healthcare because they lost their jobs where they were getting their healthcare, in addition to the 20 million who already didn't have it. So these are compounding, and they go to some of the peculiar dysfunctions of the U.S. economic and social system, with healthcare probably being the most dramatic example. And I think that shift in the suburbs can be largely traced to that. Again, there is the cultural factor of the obnoxiousness of Trump, but I think that those economic issues, so-called kitchen table, but not kitchen table, will there be enough food to eat, but kitchen table, will we be able to maintain a middle-class standard of living, I think was reverberating throughout large portions of the country.
Avant de répondre, je dois dire un grand salut à mon compagnon Pascal Petit que je vois maintenant. Salut Pascal. But let me say a few words. I think Sandra is exactly right that amongst the issues, there are really not very many issues that the American public focuses on in political campaigns, but healthcare is certainly an important one. The Democratic Party here has a big problem, which is that there are solutions to the healthcare crisis that they don't want to take. They could go for Medicare for all. They could expand Medicaid in a much more profound way than they've done already. And these things they don't want to do because they're also on the take from the insurance companies. And so they're constantly discouraging their candidates from taking positions which are highly popular with the public and would be reasonably successful. There are other reasons. I mean, there are problems with the transition to a single payer system, but this is a dilemma that the Democratic Party faces repeatedly. They like to run on healthcare, but they don't like to reform it to the extent that it really could and should be reformed. Beyond that, I want to offer a slightly more, and particularly with respect to this election, dark and cynical view, if I may do so. It turns out that there was just one group, demographic and gender category, that actually switched significantly from Trump to Biden, from Trump in 2016, away from Trump in 2020. He gained ground with women. He gained ground with the African-American community. He gained ground in the Hispanic community. And the one group that he did not gain ground with, that he lost ground with, and it cost him the election, was that one despised sector of the American electorate, the white male, which 5% shifted from Trump back to Biden. And so my suggestion is that the reason the Democrats lost in 2016 was that there was a reaction of white males to the nomination of Hillary Clinton. And there were a group of people who voted for Trump either because she was a woman or because they didn't like her personally. As I say, misogyny elected Trump. And when the Democrats nominated a man, misogyny defeated him. This is my sort of basic view of the matter. And I think it probably comports with the evidence. That does it, that have a particular policy implications for the future? Probably not, but I think the basic long-term demography of the country is now moving pretty strongly in the Democrats' favor. And the reason for that is that although they may continue to lose some ground in the upper Midwest that they reclaimed narrowly in this election, their growth of the urban professional classes, which are strongly Democratic, and of major minority groups, particularly Hispanic Latino voters in the South and Southwest, is together turning those states gradually toward the Democrats. Nevada flipped some years ago. Arizona now has flipped narrowly to the Democrats, and that's likely to deepen over time. Georgia, spectacularly, and I mentioned that the effects of voter registration efforts in the African-American community added 800,000 new voters in Georgia in the last 2 years. And so you have a shift to the Democrats there, which is a truly remarkable development. It's the first state of the Deep South to become demographically democratic. And then you have movement in the biggest prize of all, which is Texas. It's slow. It's about 3% every 4 years. Obama won 40% in 2012, Hillary Clinton 43%, Joe Biden 46%. In the next cycle, I'm confidently predicting 49%. That's not enough to carry the state, but 2 cycles from now, Texas will be contestable, if not Democratic. And at that point, it's hard to see where the Republican Party gets a majority. unless there's some further major change in the way American politics is aligned, which is always possible, of course. But the Republicans are really looking at they lost California, New York 40 years ago, California 25 years ago. If they lose Texas, the electoral college is going to be stacked against them in the way that has not been true up till now.
Alors, bonjour Pascal Petit, bonjour Daniel Drèche. Alors, je vois qu'il y a beaucoup de participants, ils ont été un peu silencieux, par contre, il n'y a pas de questions. Peut-être quelques réactions de votre part, messieurs, avant de... Pascal?
Micro, Pascal, micro. Non. Voilà.
Voilà, excusez-moi, il y a une maladie, en tout cas en Europe et certainement en France, où il y a des tels nombres de séminaires, de webinars que j'étais impliqué dans un autre avant, alors que je voulais suivre absolument. Je pense que quand même, j'avais hâte d'entendre Jamie, parce que c'est une grande et belle nouvelle, la seule depuis longtemps, que cette défaite de Trump. Il y avait un article intéressant tiré des travaux de Fourquet dans Le Monde hier, qui disait grosso modo que Marine Fontaine ne pourrait pas faire comme Trump. Et je dis, et moi j'ai interrogé, j'enverrai à Jamie les interrogations. Je pense que la question c'est pendant combien de temps ce trumpisme va rester? Est-ce qu'il ne va pas se réduire? Il y a une partie des républicains qui se trouvent avoir voté Trump alors qu'il n'est pas... Enfin, j'ai vu il y a 3 jours un film sur ces relations entre le FBI, la mafia de Brighton et Trump. Et c'est invraisemblable de penser que le bourgeois moyen républicain reste attaché à cette personne, quoi. Moi, je pense que le prochain jeu de golf qu'il aura en 2021, ça sera à Alcatraz. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Donc, l'histoire, c'est que cette bulle qui peut s'expliquer va se dégonfler extrêmement rapidement. C'est la question à Jamie.
Est-ce que le boule Trump va se dégonfler? Le boule personnel, le boule de la bourse?
Hein?
Ce boule, c'est le boule, c'est le culte de personnalité ou la bourse même?
Non, le culte de personnalité.
Le culte de personnalité, oui, je suis d'accord. Ouais. Ça va se dégonfler. Okay. Maintenant, il y a une situation assez difficile. Il n'a pas encore accepté l'élection de Biden. Et ça a commencé à gêner un peu les gens. Mais je pense que assez rapidement, il sera oublié, mais mis à part. Il y aura beaucoup de républicains qui vont, dès janvier, vont commencer à se mettre en place pour les élections de 2024. Et il y aura une tendance qu'on peut considérer assez clairement fasciste, qui va arriver en tête du Parti républicain, qui vont contester le leadership du Parti républicain. Je crois que c'est un risque assez sévère. Hein? On peut déjà voir les gens type Hawley et Pompeo qui vont suivre une ligne dure pour se mettre en place. Hein? Peut-être avec tout ça, parce qu'effectivement, ce que Trump a fait, il a détruit en fait toute tendance modérée dans le Parti républicain.
Exact.
So the question I would have for the panelists is that populism has made such an inroad into American political culture and it has grown more pronounced since Goldwater ran for president. So the question, I guess, I would like the panelists to perhaps share their thoughts is, what is the future of American populism inside the Republican Party? It seems to have a home in one of the primary institutions of American political culture. So what are your thoughts about Trumpism without Trump?
I'm happy to take a gander at that one. I want to be a little careful about the use of the term populist, which is a term that is used pejoratively and in a sense very ahistorically to describe the forces behind Donald Trump. Trump is, of course, an oligarch who has had a particular class appeal, and what he took advantage of was the fact that the Democratic Party has evolved over 40 or 50 years from being a coalition that was strongly rooted in the trade union movement to being essentially a party which is a two-headed entity. On the one side, urban professional classes who dominate the party and who are headed up by big finance on the East Coast and big technology on the West Coast. And their financial base, but basically the liberal forces who dominate America's cities, and on the other hand, the minority communities and low-income communities, African Americans, Latinx voters, to very small numbers of Native Americans, but in any event, low-income immigrant and minority communities. And those two forces, where you find the states where those two forces together add up to a majority, that's a Democratic state. The Republican Party is absolutely in the middle of the American income distribution and of the American, what you call it, class structure. It's the party of small towns. It's the party of small cities. It's the party of the countryside. It's the party of the plains. It's the party of the Old South. And those places where you have a predominant rural suburban majority, then those places are the most solidly Republican. Neither substantially wealthy nor substantially poor. Trump managed to add to that base. To get elected, he managed to add to this very small element of in the upper Midwest, and took 3 states: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And then he lost them again. And I said, I think the most likely explanation for that is simply that there was a portion of a vote that would ordinarily stay with the Democrats that simply didn't like to have to vote for the possibility of voting for Hillary Clinton. So what is the future? Future looks very much like the present, although without perhaps without anybody who had the personal dynamism that Donald Trump had. He had a certain, I mean, gave the guy a certain amount of credit. He had a certain crowd appeal, which was partly because of extreme candor, extreme disregard of the niceties of American political discourse, the ability to use Twitter to get around the hostility of the major media, and this was he blew away 17 candidates in 2016. The whole Republican establishment, he knocked them off like 9 pence. It was really, I mean, a remarkable achievement, including the scion of the Bush clan, which was not a minor political force in America. So what we're going to see is a set of younger people emerging in the Republican Party who are who will have the same base as Trump, who will come from the regions that Trump dominated, from places like Missouri, Nebraska, but who won't have who won't have anything like his personal skills. They'll substitute for it by I think taking very hardcore, harsh policy lines, and we'll see whether they can succeed with that. I wouldn't rule them in, and I wouldn't rule them out at this point.
Non, merci, c'est tout le temps qu'on a malheureusement. C'était super intéressant, very interesting. Thank you, James, Sandra, Guy-Philippe, and all the participants. We won't solve, the debate today. We won't know the answers, so that will mean that we just have to reconvene at a later date. So this is an invitation to continue and discuss with us. Very nice. Thank you, everyone. I remind you that this was recorded, and we're going to send a link for everyone to keep with them. So thank you, and see you later. See you another time.
Yeah,
Merci beaucoup, Michèle. Un grand plaisir.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.